So happy, welcome. This is the June 16th Juneteenth celebration. We know June 19th, 1865 is the very first of the Juneteenth celebrations. And in the Civil War, the Mississippi River communications between the east and west parts of the Confederacy were severed altogether. And the surrender of April 8th, April 9th, in 1865, word of that did not reach Texas until June 19th, 1865, whereupon people who'd been fighting battles and enslaved people who didn't know that they were free finally found out. And so the battles ended and people celebrated their freedom. And so that's the origin of this day. Here at Carnegie Museum in Fairfield, we've been celebrating Juneteenth this is our third year now, and we have an event here in the Carnegie Museum itself, and then a wreath laying is our tradition at Evergreen Cemetery over on Stone Avenue at Nancy Yancey's grave. And so we'll be talking a little bit about a few of the people. It turns out in our research, this is Charlotte Wright with research staff here at Carnegie. I'm Lawrence Eyre. I work with the history films, the Fairfield History Series, as the history researcher, and I've been on the board here to try to get the word out about the Underground Railroad involvement of so many people in Jefferson County. It turns out that there are far more than we can talk about in one day. And so over the course of the next few Juneteenths, it'll be our delight to be able to tell about the freedom seekers and their allies who are from Jefferson County and are buried in Evergreen Cemetery. The National Park Service, a few years back, instituted a program to what they call, to certify points along what they consider a network to freedom. And that network to freedom involved the people seeking freedom and also the people helping. And at Fairfield Cemetery, which began in 1839, that's the first burials were there, and 11,000 people are buried there now. There are many freedom seekers who chose to make Jefferson County their home, including some who enlisted in the Union Army once they found they had gained their freedom and that President Lincoln had proclaimed, emancipation. Others who had been born enslaved farther east gained their freedom, we'll see in one case today in Ohio, and came here as free people in the late 1850s and deliberately and quite publicly offered their homes as havens for people seeking freedom. Families who came from Quaker background, from Congregationalist background, who moved here in Fairfield in the 1840s, who from day one were training their children to be conductors on the Underground Railroad. We'll be talking about one of those families today. There were 17 soldiers from Jefferson County who fought and died to end slavery. So there's a large contingent of people involved. It was hard to avoid detection, but it was absolutely necessary, both for people seeking freedom and for people trying to help them. Fairfield was founded in 1839, and the county, Jefferson County, actually took its four easternmost townships from the next county over. And so we stole it from Mount Pleasant, really. And because they were surveyed first, and the last four western townships of Henry County were lopped into what the territorial legislature just called Jefferson County. From the very start, there were families here who had to be particularly quiet because it was an administrative center. Fairfield was one of the two land offices in the state of Iowa. If I'm a land officer, all I do is serve as an administrative agent. If you make a land claim, if you pay your fees, if you pay your taxes on a yearly basis, I have no questions I'm really allowed to ask you, even if I'm inclined. People then came to Fairfield with far different backgrounds as far as their positions on slavery, its morality, its immorality, its amorality. And we find that historically there are lots of people that fell into every possible group. And so people were closed-mouthed about how they felt because they didn't know if their neighbor would support how they felt. They didn't want to be judged. They didn't want to be found to be breaking the law. From 1850 onward, until the time of the Civil War, it's true that the harsh Fugitive Slave Act forced people in towns like Fairfield, under penalty of law, under penalty of loss of income or incarceration, they were required to help. Not the freedom seekers, but the bounty hunters. They were obligated by federal law to assist the tracking down of missing property. And so it was a particularly dire situation. It was required that you be willing to break the law. And it was everyone who took part, whether leaving, coming up from Missouri, which did in fact have its long border with Iowa, unbroken border, more people leaving in that decade of the 1850s than any other place in the slave states. More were leaving, more were seeking freedom out of Missouri than any other state. And everyone who came across was breaking the law. Everyone who was here who was helping them was breaking the law. Everyone who was here not even knowing that they were in their house or in their town among people who were helping others break the law were subject to the penalties imposed by the Fugitive Slave Act. So it required courage on all sides, and it required hiding. And we have examples in the people that we'll talk about today very briefly of all of them of courage and of secrecy and of inventiveness for the sake of freedom. Now, we made a 50-page application. Charlotte and I last summer spent, not this summer currently, but last summer by a conservative estimate, 200 hours, felt like years, 200 hours putting together an application for the National Park Service to join the Network to Freedom. And we had an extra challenge by the fact that there were no buildings. There was no church. There was no one's home that was, fitted for people to hide. There are places nearby, in Salem, for example, a Quaker settlement. People built a house that is still to this day. You see the secret compartments. The same with the Pearson House in Keosauqua, about 20 miles south. Nothing here that we can find, despite lots of reports over the years and decades, has actually proven to be, yep, that was for real, part of the Underground Railroad. But what we had was a terrific record-keeping apparatus at the cemetery. Evergreen Cemetery, again, has kept track of all 11,000, burials there. And we were able to use the Fairfield Ledger, the other newspapers of record here that go all the way back to the 1840s and 50s. We've been able to look at military discharge papers. We've been able to look at real estate records. We've been able to look at everything from death certificates to birth certificates we could go on, and we did to find. And what we found was really a surprisingly impressive array of people who were willing to break the law for the sake of freedom for themselves or for others. And that's really the story of what the National Park Service wants to honor in the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. And so we're happy to tell a little bit about that today. Sorry for the long-winded history lesson, but that's the context. And we'd like to talk about just a few of the people who are buried not far away, less than a mile away, who are part of that Network to Freedom and are deservedly being honored today and in the future. So,
Don't look at me.
don't look at me.
I'm only here to answer questions.
So have you heard back from the National Park Service?
Yes, thank you. We were accepted. They were delighted They asked, last Friday, I was asked to go to Mount Pleasant to speak about this cemetery and its place in the Network to Freedom. We were informed, yes, and we want you to talk about it. We were sure in our research that other places that I've already mentioned, Salem, which is south and west of Mount Pleasant, Keosauqua, as I said, but just south from here. Other places to the west of us, we've been able to uncover evidence of Jefferson County citizens, of citizens in Van Buren County, citizens in Henry County, who risked incarceration and fines and life, to be seeking freedom and helping those who were seeking. So it was an honor to uncover these things. Some of them are in the films, and I know it's a little bit cross-correlating, and I don't mean to, we're not doing this for profit. The film Heroes of Fairfield, which is the second film in the series of the Fairfield History series, details a lot. About 40 minutes worth of that film is about the Underground Railroad here, and we invite you to see that. And there are about 8 to 9 minutes in the fourth film called Ahead of Their Time, which also details, in particular, James Yancey, who's the husband of Nancy Yancey, whose wreath, Charlotte Meade, will be placed on her gravestone at the end of this. So the people that we'd like to speak about today by category, you could say, would be a freedom seeker who found his freedom, enlisted in the Union Army, fought and came back, still alive, with a desire to be in this county and live out his days. And his name is Robert Wynn. Somebody want to read it? Read along? Don't. I have to read it. Jason says I have to read it. Or you.
Oh, I can read.
Okay, good. So Charlotte's going to read.
Yeah. Robert Wynn and Mary Jane Greenup Wynn. Robert was reported to have been the last freedom seeker on the Underground Railroad route across the Skunk River in Jefferson County, which was conducted by Samuel B. McCain and Manning Mills. According to Wynn's obituary, published on March 26, 1884 in the Fairfield Ledger, he had been born into slavery in Tazewell County, Virginia, on Christmas Eve of 1834. At the age of 3, he was taken to Missouri, a state from which he escaped sometime between January 1st and September 14, 1863, when around 28 years old. He quickly joined the 1st Regiment of Iowa African Infantry, whose troops were transferred less than a year later to the 60th U.S. Colored Troops. Wynn served until the end of the war. At the time of his death, he had reportedly lived in Fairfield for several years, having moved there around 1870. Wynn died in 1884 and was buried in the old Fairfield Cemetery. It was not until 1939 that, thanks to Earl F. Hendricks of Fairfield's American Legion, Robert received the honor he deserved for his war service. Hendricks ordered and had placed on Wynn's grave a stone commemorating his service. Robert is buried in plot number 61 of the public ground of the old Fairfield Cemetery, and we have yet to find where Mary Ann is buried. She did remarry after several years after he died, but we haven't found her grave under that name either anywhere around.
Charlotte, are there any descendants?
There probably are. The Greenup family was in Fairfield for a long time, and Robert and Mary Jane did have at least 2 children, I think.
Yes. So at this stage, we're starting the next layer of tracking down as much as we possibly can, and that'll involve
Finding the descendants.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the very first newspaper in Iowa, the Burlington Hawkeye, pronounced Robert Wynn the last man to ride the Underground Railroad. It's hard to know, it can't be proven, and they admitted that, but it was a retrospective. About 30 years after the conclusion of the Civil War, they wrote who's still alive, it was part of that amazing challenge of trying to get people to freedom while the war was going on. And the story was related about Robert Wynne that he was surprised to learn, and happily surprised, of course, that he was, in fact, in a free state, which he knew, but he was also a free man because Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation January 1st of 1863. So that it was that inspiration to help other people, south of here, because it's only 30 miles to the Missouri border from where we are right now, sitting in this room, that it was a huge opportunity for him. But it required a tremendous amount of courage to do it. Glad he lived through it, and we're glad to be able to tell the story because he did turn around and go back and enlist instead of just enjoying his freedom by himself. Okay.
He participated quite a bit in the veterans group.
Yes.
From the Civil War also.
Charlotte, what are you saying?
He did participate in the meetings of the veterans groups, the GAR,
Oh, okay.
and not everywhere in the country was that so that the members of the colored troops would be able to, they would have to have their own organization,
Oh, okay.
but here they did.
That's why we're delighted that it took so long, but delighted that someone decided he deserves a better remembrance. And so the memorial stone came in 1939 through the good works of Earl Hendricks. So that's Robert Wynne, the last man to ride the Underground Railroad. Okay. Now we'll go to the front. This is Christian Burkett. When he was 10 or 11 years old, he had an experience that he wrote about at the end of his career. During his life as an adult, he became Assistant Secretary of State of Iowa. And in the 1920s, just about 3 years prior to his passing, he decided finally, after 60 plus years, it was time to tell the story of his failure as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And so I'll read it. Christian Schaefer Burkett, born and raised in Fairfield at around the age of 8 to 12, Christian began helping his Underground Railroad operator parents feed and transport escaped slaves. When his mother would say to him, "Go salt the stock," and hand him a grain sack half filled with food, he knew to walk north from their home to a dilapidated old butchering shed hidden in the woods across from the old Fairfield Cemetery. So if you're on B Street in Fairfield, where the Burketts lived is the empty lot that's right across to the east of Jet Stop. So within view of these windows. Mom would say, "Time to salt the stock, son," and he would begin either riding or just on the horse or having a wagon behind him, and would go north to the cemetery, and at the north end of the cemetery, Crow Creek turned east, and it passes now through the MIU campus and farther east before it turns south. And there he found, at the north end of the cemetery, considered haunted by many people, this abandoned slaughterhouse that was a perfect hiding place. He said, whenever I got there, it was never the case that someone wasn't hungry and didn't happily take all that had in the sack. He was instructed by his family to go up the hill, farther up B Street, to where there's a gold house at the top of the hill on the west side of B Street now. And there was no house there yet until 1870, but there was their family farm. And so what he did was, by instruction, was ostentatiously do chores. That's why his mother sent him. And he waited until dusk. After the sun set, he would begin to go back down the hill and turn left on Crow Creek, go to pick up his passenger or passengers, as the case might be. After distributing food to whatever freedom seekers were hiding there, Christian would leave and walk to his uncle's farm nearby to wait until dusk, when it was safer to take a wagon back to the shed. Arming himself, he would return to get the people waiting in the shed and transport them to Pleasant Plain. So that's 12 to 13 miles. Again, if I'm 11 years old, riding that on a horse with a wagon behind it or with someone behind me on the horse is no easy task. As secrecy was of utmost importance to the conductors and the agents and the freedom seekers themselves, Christian kept silent about his part in the events, telling no one about his memories of the experience until 4 years before he died. So he died in 1827, and it was 1823 when he finally published his event. It was called, and you can see in the note at the bottom, and it was in Annals of Iowa, and we have a link to it in our report, in our application to the National Park Service. It was called A Derailment on the Railway Invisible. I blew it. In other words, I failed. My parents never let me do that again. He lost his hat. The the triangular hat that a Quaker boy would be wearing back then was discovered by somebody, and he wasn't sure whom. The next day, he was petrified. And it turned out that a Quaker elder came up to him and said, "Son, is this thy cap?" "Yes, Uncle Josiah, it is." He says, "Thou shouldst be careful where thou hangest it up." And then but that was the end of his time. And his parents never took a chance on him again because the word was out. They had found a gun too, but he never owned up to it being his gun and got away with it. Because who's more likely to have guns, adults or a 10-year-old child with Quaker parents? So he got away, but his own parents never let him go back and be really a conductor again. Again, waiting 63 years to tell the story shows how circumspect people felt they had to be, even after the war was long over, after the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and beyond had been enacted. So Christian Burkett, as well as his parents, are buried in Evergreen Cemetery. He is on the far east side. It's one of our goals to have a designation on every one of the gravestones and every one of the markers that belong to people who are part of this network to freedom, be honored that way year-round. And so that's one of our longer-term projects.
And we don't know what happened to the slave
Yes, his
enslaved person he was trying to.
His passenger, we don't know. There was no report of him being caught. Oh. Usually, if someone were caught, it was a big deal made, especially by the people saying, "See, they shouldn't have left." So there was no report. Presumption then of being able to make it, but that's not guaranteed, and no final say on that. So freedom seeker disappeared into the woods, and that's the last he knew. And that's the other thing that quite clearly haunted young Christian, that he had failed, that he didn't know, if he'd been able to give his passenger a chance to go to freedom. I mentioned before everybody came that Christian had another code he had to follow when he was done. When he got to Pleasant Plain each night, if he did this, it was about 1 or 2 in the morning, and he had to come back the 12 to 13 miles on horseback, and he had to go directly to the butcher shop in Fairfield because butcher shops opened at 4 a.m., and obviously either Christian himself or his brothers and sisters previously had been accosted by someone, "Why are you out here this time of night? Shame on you." And he had to have meat. He said, "I'm buying meat, I bought meat from my mother, sir." And then he sent, "Get off to home with you." And so they had a whole routine. That was his job. And Lord knows if he had school the next day, good luck. I don't know what they did. In any case, that was what the children did. They were least likely to be suspected, least likely to be apprehended. But he became a vulnerable, really a break in the chain by losing his hat and losing that gun. The gun he got away with, the hat he didn't. Fortunately, a Quaker elder is the one who found it. So Christian Burkett, we have his signature. We have in the museum, for those who haven't been upstairs before. We have a lot about Christian Burkett and about his parents, Jesse and Isabel Burkett, up on 3rd floor. I think we're doing the entry last. Okay. In Iowa, in the United States generally, it's helpful for us to remember that if you were a member of a state legislature, here called the General Assembly, you are only a man. There were no women members. No women could vote until 1920. And one man from Fairfield became not only a state legislator, but a member of the House of Representatives, James F. Wilson. There's a portrait of him on this floor because he donated the land for where this building is. It was the first library, the Carnegie Library in Fairfield. But he's, I hope, will become more famous for having drafted the resolution that became the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution, abolishing slavery in the United States. James Wilson was elected to the House of Representatives and became chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. And toward the end of the Civil War, in December of 1864 and then 1865 January, what he wrote, his draft, his resolution, was voted on in the House of Representatives, and it was passed. The war wasn't quite over. It was a few more months before Lee surrendered at Appomattox. But Wilson had the foresight, and we'll see that he had the record of support for freedom for everyone to give power to what he wrote. And he was writing it at the time when the nation was able to incorporate what he really hoped for. I'll read it, and then we'll learn about James Wilson. James F. Wilson moved here in 1853 with his wife, Mary Ann King Jewett. He moved to Fairfield, where he began a law practice. From that time on, he worked in the political arena to ensure both state and federal protection of civil rights. As a delegate to Iowa's Constitutional Convention in 1857, Wilson worked to strike the word white from Iowa's racist constitution, and to ensure that every man facing restraint as a fugitive slave had a right to trial by jury, previously denied. As a Republican U.S. Congressman from Iowa's 1st Congressional District for those 8 years after the Civil War, he became known as the friend of the slave for having originated the Civil War resolution prohibiting the military from compelling return of fugitive slaves to their owners, as well as the initial congressional bill for the enfranchisement of ex-slaves in the District of Columbia. He was also the first to promote constitutional amendment abolishing slavery, and he successfully promoted passage of his bill giving freedom to the wives and children of soldiers of African descent. Wilson died at home in Fairfield, April 1895, then having retired only a month earlier as Senator James Wilson. He served 2 6-year terms. He and his wife are buried in the old plat of Evergreen Cemetery. For the people the geography of our cemetery, the burials began in 1839. It was just called Fairfield Cemetery. It became known as Old Fairfield Cemetery. And starting in 1870, Evergreen Cemetery began burying people separately by designation of who was buried where, but there are no fences between the two cemeteries. There's a sign, this way is Old Fairfield Cemetery, this is, Evergreen. For his part, Wilson was famous locally, but deserves to be famous for having stood up for freedom seekers, for freedom and the ending of slavery, even more important perhaps than donating this land.
He was probably jeopardizing his career.
Certainly as far as many people in the Senate would have been concerned, and eventual, fellow senators, and certainly as a member of the House at the time. He wasn't yet on the winning side. It seemed that the Union was going to be winning, and the war ended officially April 8th, a few months after the resolution he wrote and sponsored had passed. But it is true that had they not won, he would have certainly been out on a limb and been out of luck. in as far as his career goes, except here. So we're delighted that he's a man of high moral standing and of high courage at the same time. So James F. Wilson, there's a painting of him there. Friend of Andrew Carnegie. It seems a little bit, why is this library and now museum here? It's all because of James F. Wilson and his friendship with Andrew Carnegie. Until 1893, when this building, became the library, the Carnegie Library, the first in Iowa of over 101 of them. It was also the first Carnegie Library funded by Andrew Carnegie outside of Western Pennsylvania. He had built 4 libraries for his workers in U.S. Steel. Only those 4 libraries, and this was the 5th one ever out of the 2,000 worldwide that Andrew Carnegie sponsored or funded. So it was because of his friendship with James Wilson and Wilson's offer of land. He wasn't just seeking a handout. He was like, we'll offer the land if you can, help support our library. We had a library here in Fairfield, 1853. It was bulging at the seams with 20,000 volumes, and they tried to make a museum of it in part. They were having exhibits up on top of the bookshelves. It was a complete, unworkable, tight box. And the time was certainly right, and fortunately, Andrew Carnegie was generous enough to say yes. So Wilson, kind of a doubly appreciated person in this building.
And there's a Wilson house.
Yes, that's true, along Main Street, that's true. But we hope today, especially on Juneteenth, that we're going to be honoring James Wilson for his contribution to freedom.
I just know there's a Wilson house.
That's true. All right. So we have the very first free black couple to settle permanently in Fairfield came in 1856, early 1857. They were Nancy Yancey and her husband James Yancey. And I'm going to ask you to read it.
You tell it much better
No, I
than
won't.
I read. These guys can read. The first family of color to settle permanently in Fairfield, Mr. and Mrs. James Yancey, proved themselves superior and respected people. Both had been born, that's from her obituary, that quote. Both had been born into slavery in Virginia, but had gained freedom in Ohio well before the Civil War. Married in 1849, the Yanceys moved to Fairfield, Iowa with their children around 1857 and commenced helping freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad. As Nancy's obituary states, their home in this city was ever open to the people of their race. And in the days of slavery, many a fugitive from bondage was taken in and cared for by these good people and given an opportunity to accomplish his freedom. In Ohio, young Nancy Hale, that's her maiden name, had hungered for knowledge. In 1847 and 1848, she studied at Oberlin, the only college in the United States that would accept students of African descent at that time. When the Yanceys arrived in Fairfield, Mrs. Yancey, far better educated than most of the white women in Fairfield in her time, had been a teacher, but she was not allowed to earn bread for her family that way. Undeterred, she opened a laundry that grew to employ several people, eventually earning enough for her to support 7 children alone, a necessity beginning in 1878 when James died suddenly in Arkansas. An experienced barber, James Yancey, had set up shop as soon as the family arrived in Fairfield. He also worked as a sales agent for Hitchcock's new and complete analysis of the Holy Bible, and we have a copy of that upstairs in the display. After the Civil War ended, he was a popular orator at Emancipation Day celebrations in Keokuk and Mount Pleasant. On August 1st, 1866, he was Orator of the Day for a celebration at Capitol Square in Des Moines in commemoration of the 33rd anniversary of slavery's abolition in the British West Indies and in honor of the Emancipation Proclamation by President Abraham Lincoln 3.5 years earlier. The event was attended by 400 to 600 Iowans of color and 250 white Iowans, and James Yancey's speech was printed in its entirety, and it's quite long, in the Fairfield Ledger on November 29th, 1866.
That's a full page.
Nancy is buried in the old Fairfield Cemetery, the left half of lot 205. James's name is also on the stone, but no record has been found of his burial place.
So it's Nancy's grave that we'll be going to put the wreath. It's become a tradition. You know, we try, the cemetery is actually rather large, and there are people that find it challenging to move about, and so it's our good fortune that Nancy Yancey's memorial stone is right near a sidewalk, which is right near the street, Stone Avenue, so that people, for example, that came recently on 2 different buses of senior citizens were able to go there and be gathered and not feel like I can only look at it from, through binoculars. We want people to have a feeling for her and for their contribution. It's true, upstairs we have an exhibit for both James and Nancy Yancey. We have a facsimile of the ledger where you can see that full page. James Yancey, for his part, was ahead of his time by 54 years. In that 1866 speech, he called for universal suffrage, not just finally let's have suffrage for men of any previous condition of servitude or freedom, but for women as well. So he saw the natural extension of what was inevitable, way ahead of the general population and way ahead of Congress, certainly. So, and he's on record then from 1866 onward as standing for universal suffrage. So the family, we know they're denied chances to do things they would have done, been able to do in terms of their background educationally, but they made great use of what was available. It is often said, and it's acknowledged, that Nancy Yancey's laundry was a gathering place for the women of Fairfield to talk issues of the day and have an impact on their families by what they learned from Nancy Yancey at the laundry. So more power to her. And it's certainly true that they were able to employ people who made Fairfield their home after their own freedom had been gained. So a double win. It'll be, again, our privilege to have a chance to lay the wreath honoring Nancy Yancey and James at Nancy Yancey's gravestone. So these are just 4 people of many who, in this very small town, only 40 miles from the Mississippi River and only 30 miles from the Missouri border, have taken part in an enterprise that is a network that's nationwide, designed to forward freedom. And we're happy to be able to begin celebrating it and learning more about all the people and their involvement. We hope to learn more about the generations that have followed from these people's families and to honor them too and invite them to take part in our honoring of their forebears. So today, and if there are questions, we're happy from the History Museum standpoint to try to answer them. And we're happy also to go over to the cemetery when we're done.
Do you want to run up to the display first?
Yeah, we can go to the display. Would you like to? 3rd floor? Any questions while we're here? Yes.
So I'm just new to Fairfield.
Sure.
And I've talked to some teenagers and some other people around the last couple of days about Juneteenth. And
yes.
We went into Des Moines for their celebration.
Right.
Or Des Moines, I think you say.
Yeah, that's right. Silent S.
But I was surprised at how little knowledge people had of Juneteenth here. And I'm Irish. I grew up in Ireland, so I was educated in that system. And
yes.
It's funny that I have an understanding of it. People here wouldn't have that same. So.
And there's no question. We were talking before everybody got here about the fact that our local radio station has gone automated. There's no, the local shows we have to get the word out on our own events for the museum are, as of May 20th, in a little bit of a vacuum, actually, and that the local newspaper is now a regional newspaper with local news about once a week for this town. And there are people who are inclined to learn about museums and things that we have here, because we've had these exhibits now for 3 years, are of an age that social media isn't the way they usually talk to their neighbors and find out things. So we are a little bit in a point of challenge that we're seeking to work through and make in the schools. I've been able to bring buses of school kids here for to tour upstairs and to go along the Freedom Trail that the 10-year-old boy rode on his horse. And it's just starting. We're at the earlier stages, and we accept that it is a challenge, and we want it to be less of a challenge for people locally to know about it. It is encouraging what happened last week in Mount Pleasant, that there were people of like mind, from Mount Pleasant, from Salem, from Keosauqua, from Ottumwa, from places southwest as well. From Fairfield, that's right. And so I think that we have a good basis for building understanding, and but we're at the early stages. You're quite right.
I also wanted to just add briefly that a lot of people have been aware of it, but it didn't become nationally recognized, at least by government, until 2021.
Right, the last 3 years.
People may have had their own smaller ways to honor and celebrate, but it also didn't become a marketable holiday until recently as well. So that's kind of how a lot of the word gets out.
That's true, and it's interesting that every 6 months or twice a year, places are kind of catching fire with the idea. I have stories. We can be part of this network because it's far more extensive. They're already discovering than people had ever thought. There are far more people who took the risks, one, to get out, and two, to help them. And that's an inspiring story, no matter where we find it. And in Iowa, it's a story that hasn't been told as long. But it doesn't mean there isn't a story there. So I'm glad you knew about it, and I'm glad you brought up that it is a challenge for us, but it's one we want to address and are inspired to address, truthfully. Thanks, everybody. Let's go upstairs. We can look at the